am your host, Miss Marple. Welcome to my channel, Sherlock Midnight Echo. Remember, every quiet village hides a secret.
Little Bramble had always prided itself on being a place where nothing truly dreadful ever happened. Lives unfolded in predictable rhythms, rose pruning in the spring, the harvest flower show in the autumn, and a weekly rotation of tea gatherings hosted by ladies who maintained a competitive politeness. It was at one such gathering, on a mild Saturday afternoon, that the peaceful routine finally cracked. Mrs. Clarissa Redstone, a widow of considerable means and even greater opinions, was hosting her annual summer rose tea, a tradition she upheld with religious dedication. Her garden, the largest on Maple Lane, unfurled in wide sweeps of red and pink blossoms, whose scent mingled with the buttery richness of fresh scones and clotted cream. It was the sort of scene that would make one believe the world gentle and harmless. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the trellis draped in climbing roses, watched the gathering with her usual quiet attentiveness. She preferred these vantage points, slightly removed, yet never unnoticed, where she could unobtrusively observe the little dramas of human nature that unfolded even in the most tranquil settings. The guests had arrived in a flutter of skirts and pleasantries. Mrs. Evelyn Cross, the vicar's wife, always arranging her face into anxious warmth. Mr. Bernard Fielding, whose booming voice carried across any garden wall, accompanied by his timid sister, Lydia. Lady Agatha Penmore, who had travelled from Upper Bramble to show support, though her expression suggested she was more interested in evaluating Mrs. Redstone's roses. And finally, Eleanor Briggs, the young maid of Mrs. Redstone's household, moving briskly between tables with cups and trays, her eyes lowered with the self-conscious care of someone who rarely attended such social gatherings except in service. It was Eleanor whom Miss Marple observed with faint curiosity. The girl's movements were competent, practiced, yet every so often her hand paused with a slight tremor, as if her thoughts strayed to something deeply troubling. Most would dismiss it as nerves. Miss Marple did not. The afternoon progressed in its charming way, filled with small talk and gentle gossip. Mrs. Cross was recounting, with unnecessary detail, the vicar's recent sermon on moral responsibility, while Lady Penmore made pointed comments about the state of the village council. The conversations blended into a familiar hum, and it seemed the tea would proceed as uneventfully as always. Until the scream. It tore through the garden with such piercing horror that several teacups slipped from startled hands. Eleanor Briggs stood frozen near the refreshment table, the porcelain pot she had been carrying crashing to the ground at her feet. Her face had gone an alarming shade of white. I didn't know," she stammered, one hand pressed to her mouth. Mrs. Redstone, her composure slipping, demanded sharply, "What on earth is the matter, girl?" But Eleanor could not answer. Her eyes were fixed on the far end of the garden, near the hedge separating Mrs. Redstone's property from the old footpath leading to the churchyard. Several guests rushed toward the spot, Miss Marple following at a deliberate, steady pace. Under the shade of a flowering dogwood tree lay a man, Mr. Henry Langford, the long-time neighbour whose property bordered Mrs. Redstone's. His face was pale, unnaturally so, and his eyes were half open in a vacant stare. One arm was outstretched toward the hedge as though reaching for help. He was unmistakably dead. Gasps rippled through the group. Lady Penmore clutched her pearls. Mrs. Cross began muttering prayers. Mr. Fielding barked orders no one listened to. Miss Marple observed quietly. There was no blood, no sign of a struggle. Mr. Langford's expression was one of faint surprise, not terror. And then there was the odd placement of his hat, set neatly beside him on the grass, far too deliberate to be accidental. But it was Eleanor Briggs who drew Miss Marple's attention most sharply. The maid stood apart, trembling, her eyes fixed not on the body, but on the hedge behind it, on something unseen. She whispered, barely audibly, "I didn't mean for this to happen." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, though her voice remained gentle when she asked, "My dear, what didn't you mean?" Eleanor startled as if struck. "Nothing. I didn't. Please, I must go inside." She turned abruptly and hurried toward the house, ignoring Mrs. Redstone's call for her to stop. The garden broke into chaos. Mr. Fielding insisted they must fetch Inspector Harrow from the village station. Lady Penmore declared that she had warned everyone about the suspicious nature of solitary gentlemen. Mrs. Redstone fretted loudly about the scandal this would bring to her annual tea. Miss Marple said nothing. She knelt beside the body, her eyes tracing the faint dust on Mr. Langford's sleeves, the slight imprint of crushed grass beneath his shoes, the curious placement of his hat. Nothing added up, which she knew was often the sign that everything was about to unravel. The police arrived within 15 minutes, Inspector Harrow taking the lead with the brisk authority of a man who preferred clear answers and quick resolutions. He surveyed the garden, the guests and the body before declaring, "Looks like a heart attack. Poor fellow. Could have come over the hedge and collapsed." Mrs. Redstone nodded vigorously. "Exactly. That must be what happened. Eleanor just happened upon him." Miss Marple's voice, soft yet perfectly audible, drifted into the air. Most curious, though, Mr. Langford always wore his hat tightly pressed on his head when he walked outside. Said it kept the sun off his bald spot. Harrow frowned. "Meaning what, Miss Marple?" "Oh, nothing at all." She smiled serenely. "Just an old woman's little observation." But in her mind, threads were already connecting, threads no one else yet saw. Mr. Langford had not stumbled and died by chance. And Eleanor Briggs, the maid who fled, knew far more than she dared admit. Little Bramble, with its roses and gossip and genteel charm, was about to reveal secrets that had been hidden far too long. The garden remained unsettled long after Inspector Harrow declared the scene under control. Guests were ushered toward the patio, though none could bring themselves to leave just yet. They clustered in uneasy little knots, whispering over half-finished cups of tea as though afraid the quiet might bring back the dreadful sight of Mr. Langford's lifeless stare. Miss Marple, meanwhile, stood near the path leading to the house, her eyes following the direction Eleanor Briggs had fled. She had noticed the girl slip through the kitchen door with the anxious quickness of someone whose first instinct in crisis was not grief, but fear. Fear, Miss Marple reflected, was often far more revealing than guilt, though the two were not entirely unrelated. Inspector Harrow joined her, brushing bits of grass from his trousers. "A tragic business," he said in a tone meant to sound confident, though the slight narrowing of his eyes suggested he knew the situation was not nearly as neat as he'd claimed. "Still, these things happen. A man of his age, walking alone." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though I dare say Mr. Langford was only 62. Hardy for his age, too. Always out pruning his orchard, quite meticulous about his health." Harrow gave her a glance that walked the line between respect and irritation. "You believe something else happened?" "Oh, no," she said with her soft smile. "I only noticed his hat. Such a small thing, but hats rarely fall gently beside a man who collapses unexpectedly. They tend to roll or land askew." The inspector frowned again before clearing his throat and stepping away, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. She did not press him. She never did. Men in positions of authority, she found, were far more likely to approach her for insight once they believed the insight to be their own idea. As the last of the guests began to drift toward the gate, Lydia Fielding approached Miss Marple with a hesitant flutter of her hands. "Miss Marple, you saw Eleanor, didn't you?" She looked positively stricken. "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently, "though distress is understandable upon finding a body." Lydia leaned closer, her voice lowering. "Still, she's been strange lately. Bernard noticed it too, though he says little. Quiet at times and then anxious at others, and she avoids the footpath behind the gardens entirely. I've seen her do it, you know. Walk the long way around instead. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Lydia Fielding was a timid soul, but her observations were often sharper than those of her brash brother. Living in someone's shadow tended to make one watch the world more carefully. "And Mr. Langford?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Did you know if he ever spoke with Eleanor?" Lydia's eyes widened at the suggestion. "Oh, no. I mean, perhaps in passing, but never anything of note. They weren't connected. Quite different circles." The insistence, Miss Marple thought, was a touch too firm. People rarely denied something so quickly unless they were uncomfortable with the possibility. Before she could inquire further, Mrs. Redstone's housekeeper, Mrs. Dawes, hurried down the steps, her expression pinched. "Miss Marple, ma'am, if you wouldn't mind. Mrs. Redstone thought you might check on Eleanor. She's taken herself into the scullery and refuses to open the door." "Of course," said Miss Marple, her manner as serene as if she had been asked to evaluate a jam recipe. She followed Mrs. Dawes through the back door and into the warm, bustling kitchen, still fragrant with baked scones and lemon curd. On the far side, the scullery door stood shut. Behind it came the faint sound of someone's unsteady breathing. Miss Marple tapped lightly. "Eleanor, my dear, it's only Miss Marple. May I come in?" There was a pause. Long enough, Miss Marple noted, to suggest hesitation rather than shock, before a soft voice replied, I don't want to talk to anyone." "Well then," Miss Marple said cheerfully, "you may simply listen. Talking isn't necessary. I only wished to see how you were feeling." Another pause. Then a faint shuffling sound as the door opened just an inch. Eleanor's face appeared, blotchy from tears but still carrying the fragile pride of someone who disliked pity. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple. I'm all right. It's just... it was horrid. Truly horrid." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly. "Finding a man who has died unexpectedly is never an easy thing." Eleanor swallowed. "I didn't know he was there. I swear I didn't." Miss Marple tilted her head. "My dear, no one suggested you did." The girl looked startled. Again, too quickly. Her eyes darted toward the floor, then toward the kitchen window overlooking the garden hedge. Her hands twisted in her apron. "I don't want trouble," she whispered. I didn't mean for anything to happen." "And what?" Miss Marple asked, her voice kind but firm. "Did you not mean, exactly?" Eleanor froze, as though the words had slipped before she could reel them back. For a moment, Miss Marple thought she might speak, but then the girl shook her head violently. "I can't. I've said too much already." Miss Marple did not press her. Urgency often made frightened people retreat further. "Very well, my dear. But do rest, and if you remember anything at all, it is always best to say it sooner rather than later." Eleanor nodded, closing the door gently. As Miss Marple stepped back into the kitchen, she found Mrs. Dawes watching her anxiously. "Is she all right?" "She will be," Miss Marple said, though her expression remained thoughtful. "But she is very afraid." "Of the body?" Mrs. Dawes asked. Miss Marple looked toward the window, toward the garden where Mr. Langford's hat still lay beside the flattened grass. "Perhaps," she murmured. "Or perhaps not." For as Miss Marple knew all too well, fear in young women often came not from what they had seen, but from what they had been hiding long before anyone else noticed. And Eleanor Briggs was hiding something that had nothing at all to do with shock. It was connected to the hedge, to Mr. Langford, and very likely to the truth she dared not speak. Miss Marple lingered in the kitchen only a moment longer, allowing the gentle clatter of dishes and the hushed conversation of the staff to fade into a soft background murmur. It was enough time to arrange her thoughts without giving the impression of deliberate scrutiny. She then stepped out through the back door once more into the now quiet garden. Inspector Harrow and his constables had removed Mr. Langford's body, though the impression of his final posture remained clearly etched in the flattened lawn. His hat still lay where it had been earlier. No one had thought to move it. Miss Marple paused beside it, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, not with suspicion but with the calm curiosity of someone who understood that the smallest detail often revealed the largest truth. Her gaze drifted to the hedge. It was tall, thick, privet, with a few stray branches of bramble woven through, a perfect barrier for privacy. But someone had passed through it recently. A small gap in the lower section bore signs of disturbance. Grass crushed, leaves bent in a hurried pattern. Miss Marple touched one of the broken stems. It snapped too cleanly to have been from wind or animal. Someone, she thought, had either entered or fled. A faint sound made her turn, the crunch of shoes on gravel. Bernard Fielding approached with heavy steps, his face flushed from either distress or the briskness of his stride. His sister Lydia followed close behind, looking more hesitant. "Miss Marple," Bernard began, clearly eager to speak. "A dreadful business, this. I've known Langford for years. Good fellow, a bit quiet but harmless. Can't imagine anything untoward." "Quite," Miss Marple agreed, her tone gentle. "But," Bernard continued, lowering his voice, "you must have noticed the girl. Eleanor, the way she behaved. Running off, trembling. It isn't natural." Lydia placed a hand on his arm. "Bernard, please." She was frightened. Bernard brushed her off. "Nonsense. People don't look like that unless they're hiding something. Harrow should question her properly." Miss Marple regarded him with the mild expression she reserved for blustering men. "Eleanor is a sensitive girl. Shock affects people differently." "Shock," Bernard snorted. "She practically confessed to something." Lydia winced. "She said very little, Bernard. But enough to be suspicious," he insisted. Miss Marple watched him calmly, not missing the slight tremble in his voice. Bernard Fielding liked simple explanations and tidy narratives. Anything more complicated made him uneasy. People like him often noticed only the most obvious surface details, blind to the subtler patterns. "And what of you?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Did you see Mr. Langford arrive before the unfortunate discovery?" Bernard blinked, caught off guard. "Me? No, of course not. I was speaking to Lady Penmore near the roses. Ask her if you doubt me." Miss Marple merely smiled. She doubted nothing yet. She was only gathering threads. Lydia, who had been silent, suddenly spoke. "Miss Marple, did you notice that Mr. Langford didn't have his walking stick? He always carried it when he came this way." Bernard frowned. "Did he?" "Oh, yes," Lydia said. "I've seen him on the church path many times." Miss Marple's eyes warmed with quiet approval. "That is a very good observation, my dear." "What does it mean?" Lydia asked. "It might mean nothing," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "But very often, the things people do not bring with them tell more than the things they do." Bernard looked baffled. Lydia thoughtful, and Miss Marple, after a few more pleasantries, excused herself and made her way back toward the house. Inside, Mrs. Redstone was giving orders in the drawing-room with her usual mixture of authority and exasperation. The guests had all gone. Only the hush of unease remained. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Redstone said, waving a hand dramatically, "what an appalling day this has been. A man dying in my garden. Think of the talk. And that girl. Honestly, if she can't handle a simple task." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Eleanor found a dead body, my dear. It would unsettle anyone." Mrs. Redstone sniffed. "Well, she ought to compose herself better. I don't want this incident to reflect poorly on the household." "Incidents have a way of revealing truths," Miss Marple said, her tone mild enough that Mrs. Redstone did not notice the deeper meaning. She excused herself once more and climbed the polished staircase to the upstairs landing. Not to snoop. She never snooped, but to look out from the guest bedroom window, which offered a clear view of the garden, the hedge, and beyond it, the narrow path leading toward the churchyard. From that vantage, the path appeared undisturbed, but Miss Marple knew appearances were deceptive. If Mr. Langford had crossed through the hedge, someone might have accompanied him, or followed, and the missing walking stick troubled her greatly. A man who used it daily would not simply forget it unless he had not intended to walk at all. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Dawes stood in the doorway. "Miss Marple, Eleanor is asking for you. She says she can't rest, not without telling you something." Miss Marple nodded. Fear that grew rather than faded was a fear tied to truth. She followed the housekeeper downstairs to the small servants' sitting room, where Eleanor sat perched on the edge of a chair, hands clenched in her lap. The girl looked up, eyes wide and haunted. "I didn't want to say anything earlier," she whispered, voice trembling, "but I heard something. Just before the scream, a voice, a man's voice, and it wasn't Mr. Langford's." Miss Marple drew in a soft breath, her expression remaining serene. "My dear," she said gently, "what exactly did you hear?" Eleanor swallowed, her face paling even further. "He said, 'You shouldn't have come back.'" Eleanor's words hung in the small room like a trapped breath, fragile and trembling. Miss Marple waited a moment, giving the girl space to steady herself. She had learned long ago that truth often emerged more clearly when one did not rush it. "You're certain it wasn't Mr. Langford?" she asked softly. Eleanor shook her head, twisting her fingers together. "No, ma'am. Mr. Langford had a gentle voice, quiet, almost shy. This voice was sharp, angry. It startled me, but I didn't look. I thought perhaps two men were arguing on the footpath. Then I went to bring out the tea tray, and when I looked toward the hedge again, I saw him there." She shivered, her breath catching. Miss Marple touched her arm lightly, an anchor rather than comfort. "Did you recognize the voice, even faintly?" A pause. Eleanor looked down, lashes trembling. I don't know. It felt familiar, but I can't place it." "Take your time, my dear. Memory works best when unforced." Eleanor nodded, though the tension in her shoulders did not ease. Miss Marple noted it quietly. The girl remembered more than she was ready to say, but fear was binding her thoughts into knots. Mrs. Dawes stepped forward. "Miss Marple, we've had enough trouble for one day. Perhaps it's best she rests." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed gently, rising. "Rest will help. Eleanor, should anything more come to you, even a small detail, you may tell me privately." The girl nodded again, gratitude faint but sincere in her eyes. Miss Marple left her there, stepping into the corridor where the murmurs of the household had resumed their low rhythm. She paused beside the stair rail, gathering her thoughts. "You shouldn't have come back." The words echoed in her mind. They suggested familiarity. Someone who knew Mr. Langford, or someone he had once quarrelled with. But Langford was known in the village as quiet, unobtrusive, almost painfully polite. Few men provoked anger in others by simply existing. Yet someone had said those words with enough menace to frighten a young maid who was merely passing by. Miss Marple returned outdoors, the late afternoon light beginning to soften into evening. A constable was still lingering near the gate, though the inspector had left. She walked toward the hedge once more. The gap she'd noticed earlier still caught her attention, a small tear in the garden's perfect symmetry. Crouching, she examined the earth more closely. A slight indentation, narrow, firm, suggested the pressure of something like a shoe rather than an animal's paw. And another, fainter, led away toward the footpath. Someone had indeed passed through this hedge, and not with the stumbling uncertainty of a man succumbing to a heart attack. No, these impressions were deliberate, steady, perhaps hasty, but controlled. "Miss Marple?" a voice called. She stood slowly as Lydia Fielding approached alone, her hands clasped together. She was pale, but her eyes bright with worry. "Forgive me," Lydia said, "but I wanted to speak with you privately. Bernard would dismiss it as nonsense, but I can't stop thinking about something." "I'm listening," Miss Marple said gently. Lydia hesitated. Mr. Langford wasn't as solitary as people believed. About a week ago, I was at the greengrocer's early. He was buying apples, and I noticed him speaking with someone outside. A man. But when I approached, the man walked off quickly, as though he didn't want to be seen. Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though she kept her expression mild. And did you recognize this man? No, Lydia said, looking pained at her inability to be more helpful. He had on a hat pulled low. I only saw his coat, dark brown, worn at the cuffs. But Mr. Langford looked upset afterward, startled even. He left without buying anything more. This, Miss Marple thought, aligned far too neatly with Eleanor's frightened recollection. A tall man? She asked. Lydia blinked. I suppose so. Taller than Mr. Langford, certainly. And did you hear any part of their conversation? Only the last thing Mr. Langford said. Lydia lowered her voice. He said, I told you it's finished. Miss Marple's thoughts clicked together with a soft, inevitable certainty. Someone had confronted Mr. Langford a week before his death, and now, today, that same tension, that same unfinished business had ended beneath Mrs. Redstone's dogwood tree. Thank you, Lydia, she said warmly. You have been most helpful. As Lydia walked away, Miss Marple turned her attention back to the hedge. The disturbed leaves, the footprints, the missing walking stick, the angry voice, the unknown man with the worn brown coat. No single detail yet proved murder, but together they whispered it. The rustle of skirts drew her attention again, this time to Evelyn Cross, the vicar's wife, hurrying up the path with a strained expression. Oh, Miss Marple, she called breathlessly, I've been searching for you everywhere. There's been a development. Indeed, Miss Marple asked gently. Evelyn lowered her voice. My husband just received a message from the undertaker. They examined Mr. Langford's clothing before preparing him, and his inside jacket pocket was torn, as though something had been forcibly removed. Miss Marple's eyes brightened with a soft, knowing light. How very interesting, she murmured. And what was taken? That, Evelyn said. No one knows. The pocket was empty. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already arranging the new piece into place. A man who didn't bring his walking stick. A confrontation overheard, a pocket torn open. A mysterious figure who didn't wish to be seen. Pieces of a puzzle forming the outline of a truth. One Miss Marple suspected had very little to do with heart failure, and everything to do with the thing Mr. Langford had finished. Miss Marple thanked Evelyn Cross gently and watched her hurry back toward the vicarage. The quiet of the garden settled again, but it was no longer a peaceful quiet, more like the hush after a secret has been spoken aloud. She looked once more toward the hedge, then turned toward the path leading home. There was much to think about, and the walk would do her good. As she made her way down the lane, she passed the churchyard gate. There, half obscured by the low stone wall, stood Inspector Harrow. He wasn't alone. He was speaking to Bernard Fielding, who gestured animatedly, clearly giving what he believed to be valuable insight. Harrow's expression, however, was fixed in a polite grimace that suggested he was absorbing far more opinion than fact. Bernard spotted Miss Marple and puffed up a little, as though her presence strengthened his authority. Miss Marple, just telling the inspector what I saw, which is to say, very little, but enough to know that the maid's behavior is highly suspicious. Inspector Harrow lifted a hand as if to stall further commentary. Mr. Fielding was mentioning Eleanor Briggs' distress. Miss Marple regarded Bernard with calm that made him falter. Young girls often react strongly to shock, she said. It is unwise to mistake fear for guilt. Fear often comes from knowledge, yes, but not necessarily from wrongdoing. Harrow's eyes flickered with interest. Knowledge of what, would you say? She smiled gently. I think it best to hear it from her when she is ready. Bernard made a sound of impatience. Well, I think the police ought to press her. People shouldn't be allowed to hide things when there's been a death. Some truths, Miss Marple replied, come out more clearly when not forced by harsh questioning. Harrow frowned thoughtfully, then changed tack. Mrs. Cross said you were informed about the torn pocket. I was, Miss Marple said. A curious detail indeed. Bernard blinked. Torn pocket? What torn pocket? The inside of Mr. Langford's jacket, Harrow explained. Ripped open. Something was taken. Bernard's mouth fell open. Taken? Then it was robbery. Miss Marple considered that with the faintest tilt of her head. People rarely rob acquaintances in broad daylight at garden parties, my dear Bernard, and certainly not by forcing them into hedges. Inspector Harrow cleared his throat. Mrs. Redstone mentioned you found the body before anyone else. Bernard straightened. Yes, of course. I was only trying to help. And what brought you to that part of the garden? Harrow asked, seemingly casual. Miss Marple watched Bernard closely. Very closely. He blinked, looked down, and fussed with his cuffs. Well, I heard a sound. A rustling. From the hedge? Miss Marple asked quietly. Bernard hesitated a beat too long. Yes, something like that. Miss Marple exchanged a subtle glance with Harrow. The inspector had noticed it too. And did you see anyone? Harrow pressed. No, Bernard said quickly. No, I didn't. Miss Marple observed the faint trembling of Lydia's earlier words. He doesn't always tell the truth, Miss Marple, echoing now in Bernard's evasive tone. But she said nothing. Instead, she let the silence stretch. People revealed more when they grew uncomfortable enough to fill the quiet. Bernard huffed. Look, if you want to find the killer, perhaps speak to the man in the brown coat. Harrow turned sharply. What man? Bernard froze. Too late. I didn't mean... Lydia mentioned something about a man Mr. Langford spoke to earlier in the week. He wiped his palms on his trousers. I assumed the inspector knew. Miss Marple said gently. Lydia mentioned it in confidence. You must be careful with other people's words, Bernard. Bernard colored, flustered and defensive. I was only trying to help. You have, Miss Marple said kindly. More than you realize. Harrow gave her a sharp look, sensing layers beneath her gentle tone but unable to read them. She gave him a small nod as if to encourage him to keep digging. As Bernard walked off, muttering something about needing a brandy, Harrow stepped closer. You think he's hiding something? Oh, yes, Miss Marple said lightly. Though perhaps not what you suspect. Bernard Fielding lacks the subtlety for murder. His lies are the childish kind, the sort meant to cover embarrassment, not crime. Then what is he lying about? Miss Marple watched Bernard's retreating figure. Something he saw, something he would rather pretend he didn't. But he is not our killer. Harrow exhaled, both relieved and frustrated. So who is? Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the church path, where the hedge grew thickest and the air seemed to hold the memory of a man's angry voice. I believe, she said softly, that someone knew Mr. Langford had returned to St. Millard's after many years away. Someone who resented it. Someone who feared what he might reveal. She paused, then added with that gentle finality that made Harrow straighten. And someone with a reason to ensure he never spoke again. Before Harrow could respond, a figure appeared at the end of the lane, hurrying toward them. It was Mrs. Redstone's gardener, old Mr. Hawthorne, waving a cap in his hand. Inspector, he called breathlessly. You'll want to come quick. I was pruning near the hedge and found something. Looks like it was dropped, tangled up near where the bushes were disturbed. Harrow stiffened. What sort of something? Hawthorne reached them, breathing hard. A cuff button, sir. Silver. Looks expensive, and it's got initials engraved on it. Miss Marple's eyes brightened with a quiet, knowing glimmer. What initials? Harrow demanded. Hawthorne held it out in his weathered palm. B.F. Harrow blinked. Bernard Fielding. Miss Marple folded her hands together calmly. No, she said softly. Those initials are far older than Bernard's connection to this affair. That button, if my memory serves, is from a set belonging to someone else entirely. Harrow stared at her. Who? Miss Marple's voice dropped to a whisper. Benedict Farrow. The hour had grown later than Miss Marple realized, for once she rose from the vicarage sofa, the lamps had been lit and shadows stretched long across the sitting-room floor. Her needles clicked once more before she set them down in her basket, a quiet sign that her mind had arrived at a point of interest. Griselda, who had been recounting the more outrageous speculations from the village, paused in mid-sentence. "Something troubles you," she said, narrowing her eyes shrewdly for a woman often considered frivolous. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Not troubles, dear, only patterns. One finds them everywhere if one listens." That remark lingered as she took her coat and made her way back into the cool evening air. St. Mary Mead was unusually hushed, the earlier gossip having exhausted itself into wary whispers behind curtains. Lanterns glowed faintly inside cottages, and the scent of damp hedgerows followed her along the lane. She walked at a measured pace, not slow, merely thoughtful, as she followed the path toward the Howard residence. The house stood still and watchful, its darkened windows reflecting only the faintest remnants of dusk. Near the porch, a constable shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his notebook as if hoping it might grant him clarity. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his cap. "Good evening, Mr. Tillons," she replied warmly. "I wonder, might I have a word with Inspector Graves? The matter concerns something I believe he will want to consider soon if he hasn't already." The constable nodded, grateful for any sense of direction. He ushered her inside where the inspector stood amid the still disordered drawing-room, reviewing statements with the air of a man who had been handed too many. Threads and no loom on which to weave them. "Miss Marple," Graves said, nodding respectfully. "More observations, I presume?" "Only a few," she said lightly. "And perhaps a question or two if you'll indulge an old woman." Graves almost smiled. "I've learned better than to underestimate your questions." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. People do tend to reveal more than they intend when discussing household arrangements. The rhythms of domestic life are quite revealing. She let her gaze fall upon the writing desk again, the spot that so captivated her earlier. The inspector noticed and approached with her. "You think the spilled ink matters after all?" he asked. "Not the ink itself," she murmured, "but the hand that spilt it. You see, Inspector, tidy homes are rarely disturbed in only one way. When someone rifles through a desk, they generally make a proper mess. But the ink blot, that looks rather accidental, as though someone was startled." Graves frowned, considering this. "Startled by what?" "By whom might be the better question," she said softly. The inspector's expression grew sharper, more alert. "You think she caught someone in the act?" Miss Marple did not answer directly, but her fingers brushed the edge of the blotting paper with a feather-light touch. "I should be very interested, Inspector, to know who besides the household staff had reason to wander this room in recent weeks." Graves inhaled slowly. Lady Howard entertained fewer visitors than most, apart from the charity committee women and her stepson, Miss Marple supplied gently. "Mr. Leonard Howard." The inspector nodded, though without satisfaction. "He claims he hardly visited the estate unless summoned." "Claims," Miss Marple repeated, her tone mild, but her meaning unmistakable. The inspector's notebook emerged at once, his pencil poised. "You believe he came here more often?" "I believe," she said carefully, "that the maid Jane's anxiety might stem not from what she witnessed, but from what she knows she must not reveal. A young woman working in a house can hear conversations, private ones, without ever meaning to listen, and people do say the most unguarded things when they think the help invisible." Graves looked thoughtful, then grim. "If Leonard was here that morning—" "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Then Jane may have encountered something far more troubling than a simple disagreement over household accounts." A quiet creak interrupted them. Just the settling of the old house, the inspector told himself, though Miss Marple turned her head slightly, as if listening to something beyond sound. It was the peculiar stillness of the place, the lingering tension in the air that comes when truth lies close at hand, waiting to be touched. Miss Marple lowered her voice, her words deliberate. "Have you, Inspector, questioned Mrs. Weatherby thoroughly? She seemed distressed earlier, more than mere shock. Her hands trembled when she mentioned Jane, and I sensed that Mrs. Weatherby knows something she hesitates to reveal." Graves' brow tightened. She was reluctant, yes? Claimed it was not her place to gossip. "Gossip sometimes has a kernel of truth," Miss Marple said gently. "One only needs to sift the chaff." The inspector straightened, determination settling over him. "I'll speak to her again, immediately." Miss Marple inclined her head graciously. "I think that very wise." She watched him leave the room, the echo of his footsteps fading down the hall. Alone now, she regarded the quiet space, her eyes drifting to the garden beyond the window. The faint outline of the rose arch stood silhouetted in moonlight, and farther beyond lay the servants' entrance, shadowed, easily overlooked. Her mind touched the pieces one by one, the trembling maid, the restless companion, the air with uncertain motives, the accidental spill of ink that only an abrupt movement could have caused. And then, softly, a new thought slipped into place. Someone else had been near this room, someone who should never have had reason to be. She turned toward the hallway, her expression serene yet subtly altered, as though a door inside her mind had quietly opened. The truth had not emerged yet, but it had begun to stir. Miss Marple stepped quietly into the hall just as Inspector Graves reached Mrs. Weatherby's door. The inspector knocked, and after a brief hesitation, the housekeeper opened it, her expression wan and tight. She had removed her apron, though her posture still held the stiffness of someone who had been holding themselves together for far too many hours. "Mrs. Weatherby," Graves began, his tone polite but firm, "I'm afraid I must trouble you again." The housekeeper's eyes flickered toward Miss Marple, and something like resignation softened her features. She stepped aside wordlessly, allowing them in. The small sitting room was tidy to the point of rigidity, with not a single cushion out of place, but Mrs. Weatherby herself looked decidedly less composed. Her hands twisted the corner of a handkerchief, an old one, faintly embroidered, over and over as though each turn helped her swallow a secret. "Please sit," she murmured, barely above a whisper. I knew this moment must come." Miss Marple took the invitation with a gentle inclination of her head, her presence calm and unobtrusive, the way a kindly aunt might sit with a troubled niece. Inspector Graves remained standing, sensing that whatever was about to surface required no pressure from him. Mrs. Weatherby lowered herself onto the stiff-backed chair opposite them. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked like thin ice underfoot. "It wasn't my place to say anything earlier," she began, "but I can't. I can't keep pretending I don't know what's troubling Jane." Miss Marple said nothing, simply waiting with that patient attentiveness that encouraged confidences more effectively than any interrogation. Mrs. Weatherby swallowed hard. The girl overheard something. Not on the day of the tragedy, but before, a week, perhaps 2. She was dusting the hallway, quiet as she always is, when Mrs. Howard and Mr. Leonard had one of their disagreements. Inspector Graves leaned forward slightly. "Disagreements? What sort?" Mrs. Weatherby drew a shaky breath. "Money, sir. He wanted it. She wouldn't give it. She said he'd had enough already, that she'd not fund his ventures any longer, and he said something dreadful." A brief pause. Miss Marple noticed that the woman's grip on the handkerchief had tightened visibly. "He said," Mrs. Weatherby continued, her voice trembling, You'll regret crossing me. One day you'll find out what real misfortune is." Inspector Graves stiffened, his pencil poised but unmoving. "Why didn't you tell us this earlier?" he asked. Mrs. Weatherby looked down, shame weathering her face. "Because Mr. Leonard is family, sir, and Mrs. Howard. She never liked scenes. She wouldn't have wanted such a quarrel made public. And Jane, she begged me not to repeat it, said she wished she'd never heard it. She's been afraid ever since." Miss Marple regarded the housekeeper thoughtfully. "Afraid of Mr. Leonard?" Mrs. Weatherby's eyes flickered. "Afraid of everyone. Afraid of saying the wrong thing. Afraid of being blamed. She was a good girl, truly. But she's young, and when she heard that terrible argument, she began thinking it was somehow her burden. She believed she'd be caught between them." Inspector Graves exhaled slowly, the pieces shifting in his mind. "This changes the picture considerably." Miss Marple, however, remained serene. "It clarifies Jane's distress? Yes. And yet—" Mrs. Weatherby glanced up at her, startled by the gentle hesitation. "And yet," Miss Marple continued softly, "fear of a quarrel is one thing, but the kind of overwhelming panic Jane displayed this morning, her trembling, her pallor, that came from something more immediate, something present." Inspector Graves studied Miss Marple sharply. "You believe she saw something today, not just before?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, voice like soft lace, "that Jane stumbled upon someone in this house after Lady Howard's death. Someone who should not have been where they were. Someone who frightened her enough that she no longer trusts her own silence to keep her safe." Mrs. Weatherby gasped softly, her hand rising to her mouth. "Oh, heavens! Do you truly think—" Miss Marple gently patted her hand. "My dear, I think Jane needs to be found and spoken to before fear leads her into even greater danger." Inspector Graves straightened, resolve firming. "She's not in her room. We searched earlier." Mrs. Weatherby's voice rose sharply in fear. She wouldn't run away, would she?" Miss Marple stood, her expression thoughtful yet edged with quiet urgency. "Not run, no, but hide. Quite possibly. Terrified young women rarely travel far. They choose places where they feel unseen." Her eyes drifted toward the window, to the darkened grounds beyond. "The gardens," she murmured. "Or perhaps the old potting shed." Mrs. Weatherby wrung her hands. "Oh, that poor girl! If she's out there alone—" A sudden sound interrupted her, a faint, distant clatter from somewhere outside. Metallic. Brief. Out of place in the silence of the night. Inspector Graves's head snapped toward the noise. Miss Marple's expression grew grave. "That," she said quietly, "was not the wind." And in that instant, the sense of danger that had hovered at the edges of Miss Marple's thoughts settled into sharp, undeniable certainty. Someone else was out there, moving through the darkness with purpose. And they were not alone. The three of them froze, listening, though the night had already swallowed the sound. Mrs. Weatherby pressed a hand to her chest, her breath shallow, while Inspector Graves moved swiftly to the doorway, his instincts sharpened by the unmistakable note of threat. "I'm going out there," he said, already stepping into the hall. "Mrs. Weatherby, stay inside. Miss Marple." But Miss Marple was already reaching for her shawl with calm deliberation. "I shall come as well," she said. "I assure you, Inspector, I've no intention of charging into danger, but I believe I may know where the noise originated." Her certainty gave him pause. In truth, Graves no longer considered refusing her. Experience had taught him it would only result in her following quietly at a distance, likely discovering something before he did. They stepped out into the cool night where the air felt weighted, expectant. The moon was half veiled by drifting clouds, stretching shadows across the lawn in long, uneasy streaks. Mrs. Weatherby lingered anxiously in the doorway as they descended the steps. "Where?" Graves asked in a low voice. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the grounds, pausing on the faint silhouette of the garden path. "The potting shed," she murmured. "The latch is loose. It makes that particular clatter when disturbed." The inspector nodded and drew his torch, its beam slicing through the dark as they moved toward the garden. Gravel crunched underfoot with soft urgency, and the scent of damp earth and roses grew stronger as they approached the archway. Halfway down the path, Miss Marple halted, touching the inspector's arm gently. "Listen," she whispered. A faint sound, scraping, then the low thud of something being hastily dropped, drifted from the direction of the shed. Graves stiffened. Someone was inside. He motioned for silence and advanced, Miss Marple following a few paces behind, her steps careful but unhesitating. The potting shed stood slightly ajar, the door just wide enough for a thin sliver of light to escape. The inspector lowered his hand to the latch, then swung the door open in one decisive motion. "Police!" he barked. "Show yourself!" The figure that whirled around inside was small, hunched and trembling. Jane, her apron smeared with dirt, her eyes wide with terror. Oh, please, sir, don't let them. She broke off, choking on a sob. Graves moved toward her at once. "Jane, you're safe. No one is going to harm you." Miss Marple stepped softly beside him, her voice warm and steady. "My dear, you must breathe. You've been terribly frightened, I see. But frightened of what? Or of whom?" Jane's gaze darted toward the doorway as if expecting a shadow to detach itself from the darkness. Her hands clutched her skirt, knuckles white. "I shouldn't have come out here," she whispered. "But I could hear footsteps earlier, near the back of the house, and I thought they might be watching me. I thought they knew I saw." Inspector Graves exchanged a sharp glance with Miss Marple. "Who knew, Jane? What did you see?" The girl shook her head violently. "I can't, if I say it out loud." Miss Marple knelt beside her, ignoring the damp earth beneath her knees. "Child," she said softly, "truth has a way of protecting those who speak it. Fear grows only in silence." Jane's breath hitched, her eyes filled with tears, spilling one by one. "I saw someone," she whispered finally. "Not when Lady Howard died, but just afterward, in the corridor by her room. They weren't supposed to be there. They didn't know I was dusting behind the stair curtain. And when they saw me, oh, their face. So white, so furious." Miss Marple touched her hand. "And you ran," she said gently. Jane nodded with a shudder. "I ran and hid in the laundry, and they watched the corridor for so long after, waiting, listening. I knew if I spoke, they'd say I was lying, or worse." Inspector Graves' jaw tightened. "Jane, you must tell us who it was." The girl glanced toward the open door, toward the dark beyond the shed, as if expecting the night itself to answer. Her voice dropped to a trembling whisper. It was Mr. Leonard." A stillness settled over the shed, heavy as wet wool. Graves exhaled sharply through his nose, fury and grim vindication mixing in his expression. Miss Marple, however, did not look surprised, only saddened. Jane broke into fresh sobs, burying her face in her hands. But before Graves could offer reassurance, a sudden rustle outside snapped all three into silence, a footfall on gravel, too deliberate to be wind or animal. The inspector whirled, reaching for the door. Miss Marple's eyes widened, her voice barely a breath. "Inspector, someone's out there." The rustle came again, lighter this time, but unmistakable. Inspector Graves moved to the threshold in 2 swift strides, bracing one hand on the doorframe as he swept his torch across the garden path. Its beam cut through leaves and bramble, hollow pots and overturned soil, but nothing moved, nothing visible, at least. Behind him, Jane whimpered and shrank back into the shadows of the shed, clutching her apron as though it were a shield. Miss Marple rose slowly, dusting her palms with her usual composure, yet there was a keen alertness in her eyes, like a cat listening beneath the calm. "Inspector," she murmured softly. "If someone meant harm, they would not linger. They would flee." "Or they might be hoping we do," Graves muttered, stepping out onto the gravel and scanning the edges of the rose bushes. The night air hummed with tension, every creak of wooden trellis and whisper of wind through petals, amplifying the sense of unseen presence. Miss Marple followed him with measured steps. "Footsteps can be misleading in the dark," she said gently. "Echoes move strangely among hedges, and fear sharpens the imagination, but Jane's reaction suggests someone truly was here." "And that someone," Graves growled, "may still be watching." He took several paces into the path, sweeping the torch left and right before crouching near a patch of disturbed gravel. He pressed his fingers to the ground. "A footprint," he said tightly, "fresh and heavy." Miss Marple joined him, peering down with quiet interest. "A man's boot," she observed, "and not the constable's. Mr. Tillins is a lighter walker." Graves stood abruptly. "Leonard," he hissed through his teeth, "trying to spy on us. Perhaps even following Jane." Miss Marple's brow furrowed, but not with the same certainty. "It is possible," she conceded, "but footprints alone seldom tell the whole tale. Still, whoever it was, they wanted to know whether Jane had spoken." A faint sob drifted from inside the shed, reminding them the girl still trembled in fear. Graves returned quickly, his tone softening. "Jane, it's all right. We'll take you back to the house. You'll stay in the sitting room with Mrs. Weatherby until morning, somewhere safer with someone to keep watch." Jane nodded shakily, wiping her face with the back of her hand. Miss Marple offered her arm, and the girl leaned into her with an exhausted sort of trust. Step by careful step, they led her from the shed and back along the path. The house glowed warmly in the distance, the only patch of light in the dark expanse of garden. But as they reached the steps, Jane stopped suddenly, her breath catching. "In there," she whispered, staring at the back entrance. "I heard someone earlier. Inside." Graves stiffened. "Inside where?" "The pantry," she said, voice trembling. I didn't say anything because I thought it was Mrs. Weatherby collecting linens, but now I'm not sure." Inspector Graves didn't hesitate. He signaled Miss Marple and Jane to stay behind him, then pushed the back door open silently. A hush enveloped the corridor. The faint smell of lavender polish drifted up from the wooden floorboards, masking something else, something metallic. Miss Marple caught it at once. The tang of cold iron, old dust, and something more dangerous beneath it. Graves advanced slowly. Miss Marple, unable to remain entirely behind, followed at a careful distance, her steps as soft as a whisper. Jane remained clutching the door frame, too frightened to take another step. The inspector reached the pantry door and turned the knob with a slow, steady motion. The door swung inward. The room appeared empty. Rows of neatly stacked jars, folded linens, and shelves of preserved fruit glistening faintly in the lamplight. Nothing moved. But Miss Marple's eyes flicked downward, toward the faintest smear on the lower shelf. A streak, barely visible. A small curving line of disturbed dust where something, perhaps a hand, had rested. "Inspector," she murmured. Graves stepped closer, shining his torch on the shelf. His lips thinned. "Someone was here. Recently." "And they left in a hurry," Miss Marple added quietly. She turned, her gaze moving up, and then she saw it. The window latch above the pantry sink, still quivering, as though someone had pushed it open only moments before. Graves lunged forward and shoved the window wide, leaning out into the night, but the garden lay silent once more. The intruder vanished. Miss Marple touched the edge of the window frame, frowning slightly. "Inspector," she said softly, "someone is growing desperate." Graves lowered the window slowly, his jaw set. "Yes, and desperate people make mistakes." Miss Marple gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Indeed. They also tend to return to the one place they feel control slipping away. Her gaze drifted back toward the dark garden with a thoughtful stillness. Which means, Inspector, the next move may come far sooner than either of us expected. Miss Marple remained by the pantry window, her fingers lightly resting on the sill as if she could feel the weight of the intruder's presence lingering in the cool night air. The moonlight pooled across the floor, casting angular shadows that made the room seem larger, more ominous than it truly was. Jane's small, frightened whimpers reminded her that the girl was still a witness, vulnerable and unsettled. Inspector Graves moved back toward the main hallway, every sense taut with vigilance. They could have gone anywhere by now, he muttered, frustration evident in his voice. And yet, something tells me they didn't go far. Miss Marple turned, her sharp gaze meeting his. Precisely. Fear is often a cage, Inspector, and desperate people rarely stray beyond the places they think offer them advantage. She inclined her head subtly toward the garden, where moonlight traced the edges of the rose arch and the footpath leading toward the hedge. I should not be surprised if our friend returns to the very scene they believe no one will watch. Graves frowned. You mean back to the pantry? Perhaps. Or nearer to the shed, she said, her tone soft, deliberate. Somewhere they feel hidden, but where curiosity and anxiety draws them once more. Jane's voice trembled. Do you think it's Mr. Leonard, the one I saw? Miss Marple nodded ever so slightly. Yes, my dear, the signs are far too consistent. But he is clever. He may not reveal himself openly. Yet cleverness, when stretched by desperation, tends to make one predictable. The inspector's eyes narrowed. Predictable? How? Miss Marple tapped the edge of the window frame. People return to what they understand best. They seek control over the elements they fear losing. In this case, it is the evidence, or what they believe to be evidence, and the one place most convenient for their purposes, yet easiest to guard, is often closest to the scene of their original act. Graves exhaled sharply. So we wait. And watch. Not exactly, she said, lifting a hand. We prepare. We do not watch passively. We create the opportunity for the intruder to reveal themselves, not through force, but through the subtler nudges that prompt human behavior. Fear, expectation, and curiosity, these are more revealing than any direct confrontation. Jane shivered. Do I need to stay here? For now, Miss Marple replied. Safe and out of sight. But you may be our quiet observer later. Often it is the one who believes they are unnoticed who sees most clearly. The inspector straightened, rubbing his hands together. All right, what do you propose we do then? Miss Marple's lips curved in the faintest smile, almost imperceptible in the dim light. We prepare, Inspector. You position yourself so that anyone approaching the pantry or the garden sheds cannot avoid your presence. And I shall engage with the household as though nothing untoward has occurred. Our intruder must believe the house is undisturbed, the household oblivious. Only then will they reveal themselves. Graves hesitated. You really think he will come back? People like him rarely understand how closely they are watched, she said, and they often act upon what they believe is a final chance. To correct, to retrieve, to hide what they imagine incriminates them. Jane's small voice piped up again, brimming with renewed anxiety. But if he comes back, what if he sees me? Miss Marple's hand rested lightly on the girl's shoulder. Then you will stay calm, my dear. Your role is to appear unaware. Sometimes pretending ignorance is the safest strategy of all. Graves nodded grimly, finally understanding the delicate balance Miss Marple envisioned. All right, I'll take position near the garden path. Miss Marple, you'll remain inside. Not entirely, she said, moving back toward the main hall. I shall circulate subtly, observe conversations, mannerisms, small gestures, anything that unsettles the composure of those who walk these halls tonight. Fear has a way of speaking even when lips are silent. The plan, simple yet elegant, took root in the quiet house. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. Every detail, the missing walking stick, the torn pocket, Jane's terrified observation, the mysterious footprints, Leonard's known presence in the house, now converged into a pattern. Each element was a whisper of intent, a trace of human weakness, a key to uncovering what otherwise might have remained hidden. Outside, the night deepened. The hedges swayed in the light breeze, the shadows deepened, and somewhere, beyond sight but not beyond influence, the intruder watched and waited. Miss Marple straightened, her hands clasped quietly in front of her. Tonight, patience would serve as both shield and weapon. And when the moment arrived, the truth would emerge, not through force, but by the very nature of human behavior itself. She allowed herself the faintest, almost imperceptible smile. Everything was in motion. The final act was about to begin. By the time the house had quieted and the last of the evening chores concluded, the tension in St. Mary Mead had grown nearly tangible. Miss Marple moved with her customary grace among the household, tea tray in hand, smiling and commenting on trifles as though nothing of import had occurred. The maids and cooks, unaware of the precise plan unfolding, relaxed slightly under her light presence, their whispers and curiosity directed toward her, not the shadows she was tracking. Inspector Graves took his post at the far edge of the garden path, eyes trained on the dark shapes beyond the lamplight. He shifted occasionally, keeping silent watch over the spots Miss Marple had indicated. The hedges, the shed, the pantry window, while the night stretched and deepened, absorbing all sound and detail. Inside, Miss Marple paused by the drawing-room window, glancing out with faintly narrowed eyes. She noticed a subtle disturbance among the rose bushes near the garden path, a shadow that moved just a fraction too deliberately, then paused as though calculating the scene beyond. It was the small, telling hesitance that bespoke someone who believed themselves unseen, yet could not resist checking for confirmation. As if on cue, a faint creak came from the kitchen doorway. Miss Marple's attention shifted smoothly, her expression composed, yet all her senses were alert. From the sitting-room corner, she called in her most natural conversational tone. "I do hope I'm not interrupting anyone. The night is chilly, and the kettle has only just boiled. Perhaps some tea might help a restless soul." From the kitchen, Leonard Howard froze mid-step, his hand clutching a small bundle he had just been about to conceal. His eyes flicked nervously toward the drawing room, then toward the garden. Miss Marple, catching the movement from her vantage point, tilted her head ever so slightly, a signal to herself more than to anyone else. The faintest glimmer of satisfaction brushed her face. Leonard hesitated, then moved as though compelled by curiosity or desperation toward the pantry. Miss Marple allowed herself a slow, deliberate walk toward the hallway, each footfall measured but silent, drawing his attention without seeming to. He paused just inside the doorway, casting a furtive glance around the dimly lit corridor. Meanwhile, Inspector Graves, alert to the faint sound of movement, edged closer to the garden, his torch poised. He spotted Leonard's shadow pass by the pantry window, confirming Miss Marple's suspicions. Graves held his position, careful not to reveal himself too soon. Inside, Miss Marple engaged in gentle conversation with Jane and Mrs. Weatherby, her tone light, her words seemingly innocuous. But every phrase, every glance was designed to provoke a reaction, and it worked. Leonard, peering from the pantry doorway, shifted uneasily, his fingers tightening around the small bundle he carried. Then, as if the tension had reached a breaking point, Leonard stepped fully into the pantry, thinking to retrieve or perhaps hide what he believed would solve his problem. The bundle fell to the floor with a soft thud, the sound betraying him completely. Graves emerged from the garden path just in time, his torch catching Leonard mid-step. "You're quite caught, Leonard," Miss Marple said softly from the hallway, her voice calm and unassuming, yet firm. "I do believe the truth has been patiently waiting for us." Leonard froze, panic flooding his features. His lips parted, then closed again, searching for a lie that would not hold. The small silver cuff button, engraved with initials and found earlier in the garden, had already sealed the narrative, as had Jane's terrified witness account. Miss Marple stepped forward, serene, almost maternal in her approach. The disturbances, the torn pocket, the anxious maid, all these things point to a sequence that no force can hide, Leonard. You cannot hide from the behavior that fear itself dictates. Inspector Graves moved in behind her, subtly cutting off any escape, while Leonard's composure crumbled entirely. The bundle spilled open, a set of documents folded carefully, some appearing to be letters, others receipts and notes, each a fragment connecting him to the events surrounding Mr. Langford's death. "You believed you could retrieve these unnoticed," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet yet unmistakable. "But you underestimated the quiet attention of those who observe without spectacle, and in doing so, you revealed everything." Leonard sagged against the pantry shelf, the weight of inevitability pressing down. I didn't mean," he began. But no excuse could fill the spaces between the facts that had so patiently revealed themselves. Miss Marple's eyes softened, as though pitying both the man and the small misjudgments that had brought him here. "It is always the small human errors, Leonard," she said, "that betray the greatest secrets, and in our village, patience and observation are often the only justice required." The night air, the garden shadows, and the silent, observant house had all played their part. Leonard Howard, cornered not by force but by the unrelenting clarity of subtle observation, finally understood that the truth, no matter how carefully concealed, has a way of coming to light. Jane, clutching her apron with trembling hands, could now breathe more freely, knowing she had witnessed the resolution without danger, while Miss Marple, serene and quietly triumphant, allowed herself a small, knowing smile as the inspector readied to secure the evidence and formalize the arrest. The puzzle had been solved, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the meticulous unraveling of human behavior, careful attention, and the subtle art of patience. The house had finally settled into an uneasy calm. Leonard Howard, escorted by Inspector Graves, was carefully led from the pantry, the small silver cuff button glinting in the lamplight as evidence, the bundle of documents clutched under his arm. Jane, still trembling, was guided to a chair near the hearth, where Mrs. Weatherby fussed over her with gentle admonishments, trying to restore some sense of normalcy to the household. Miss Marple remained standing by the doorway, her hands folded neatly in front of her, observing quietly. The resolution had arrived, yet her mind continued to trace the threads of the evening, noting how easily a single act of desperation could ripple outward, stirring fear and suspicion in those nearby. Inspector Graves exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. "Remarkable," he said, his voice low with awe and fatigue. "You managed to unravel the truth without a single harsh question, Miss Marple. I confess I've never seen anything quite like it." She smiled faintly, as though this were less a compliment and more an acknowledgement of something long understood. "Human nature, Inspector, is always the most revealing evidence. It has a way of speaking when the mind tries to hide it. One must only be patient enough to listen." Graves nodded, gazing toward Leonard, whose head hung in a mixture of shame and resignation. And Jane, she did more than simply witness. She held her composure long enough to allow the truth to emerge. A brave girl, truly. Miss Marple's eyes softened at the mention of the young maid. Indeed, courage is often quiet, and it does not always announce itself with fanfare, but it is precisely this quietness that allows one to see the world as it is, unguarded. The inspector allowed a pause, then spoke again, more softly. "Do you think the rest of the village will ever understand what truly happened here tonight?" Miss Marple's gaze swept the familiar walls of the Howard residence. "Some will, Inspector. Others will whisper guesses that are only partially accurate. But that is of little consequence. What matters is that the wrong is addressed, the frightened reassured, and the secrets exposed before they can fester into further harm." Outside, the first faint light of dawn began to touch the horizon, casting a gentle glow over the gardens and the Rose Arch. The night's shadows were lifting, yet the echoes of tension remained, subtle and persistent, a reminder that even in peaceful villages, human frailty and hidden resentments could stir the most unexpected storms. Miss Marple moved toward the drawing room, her footsteps soft against the floorboards. She poured herself a cup of tea, lifting it to her lips with the serene composure that belied the storm of observation she had quietly conducted throughout the night. Jane, now calm and reassured, watched her with wide eyes. "Miss Marple, did you know all along?" she asked in a whisper. Miss Marple smiled, a gentle warmth in her eyes. "I did, my dear, not in every detail, but in the essentials. Fear, deceit, and the small traces of human behavior. These are the things one can read with patience and care." Outside, the village stirred. The baker's oven fires crackled to life. The church bells began to toll faintly, and the first villagers emerged, unaware of the drama that had unfolded in the night. Within the Howard residence, life would slowly return to its measured rhythm, though the lessons of vigilance, patience, and subtle observation would remain with those who had borne witness. Miss Marple settled into her chair, sipping her tea, eyes drifting toward the window. The mystery had been resolved, Leonard Howard's guilt confirmed, Jane's courage honored, and the fragile equilibrium of St. Mary Mead restored, if only temporarily. For Miss Marple knew, as always, that human nature is endlessly intricate, and the quiet village, no matter how serene, would always contain secrets waiting for the careful observer to uncover. And so, with a small, knowing smile, she reflected once more on the eternal truth she had long understood. In every whisper, every glance, every hesitating movement, the story of human hearts reveals itself, if only one has the patience to see it. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the lace curtains, scattering warm patterns across the sitting-room floor. Mrs. Weatherby moved quietly, arranging tea and scones with a meticulousness that seemed to anchor the household after the tense night. Jane sat at the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression more composed now, though the shadows of fear still lingered faintly in her eyes. Miss Marple remained near the window, her teacup poised in her hand, observing the gentle rhythm of life resuming. There was a serenity in the scene, yet her mind, always attuned to subtle details, traced the implications of the night's revelations. Leonard Howard had been taken into custody, the documents and evidence he had attempted to conceal now securely in Inspector Graves' possession. Still, Miss Marple sensed that the true measure of human character would emerge not merely in confession or arrest, but in the quiet reflections that followed. Jane finally spoke, her voice tentative but clear. "Miss Marple, will things go back to normal now?" Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Normal, perhaps, but one always carries the memory of what has passed. It is how we respond to it that shapes the next days, the next decisions. Courage and honesty have a way of restoring order, though. And you, Jane, have shown both in abundance." Mrs. Weatherby interjected, her voice trembling slightly. "I dare say the girl has been brave indeed. I confess I feared she might be too young to bear such knowledge, yet she faced it with a composure I could hardly have expected." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Composure is a form of courage, Mrs. Weatherby, and in observing others, one often sees courage in the smallest acts. The restraint of a gaze, the steadying of hands, the choice to speak when silence would be safer. A soft knock at the door announced Inspector Graves's entrance. He carried a small bundle of Leonard Howard's belongings, now fully catalogued as evidence. "Everything is accounted for," he said, placing the items on a side table. "The arrest went smoothly, thanks in large part to your observations, Miss Marple. And Jane, well, your cooperation has been invaluable." Jane's eyes widened at the praise, a tentative smile breaking through her lingering fear. I only did what I thought was right," she murmured. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, reassuring. "And that, my dear, is often the very definition of right." The inspector glanced at Miss Marple with a mixture of respect and curiosity. "I must ask, then, how you pieced everything together. I saw Leonard's panic, yes, but how did you know where to watch or that he would return to the pantry?" Miss Marple sipped her tea before replying, her voice calm yet precise. "Patterns, Inspector. Familiarity with human nature. People act in ways that reflect their fears, their desires, and their understanding of control. The young often hide when frightened. The guilty tend to revisit places where they believe evidence is at hand. And the restless, who cannot bear suspense, move predictably when they think no one is observing. One only needs patience and a keen eye." Graves nodded slowly, absorbing her words. And Jane's testimony, the maid's observation, was key. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, fear and honesty often intersect. Jane did not seek to deceive, she only sought safety, and in seeking it, she illuminated the path to truth." A comfortable silence settled over the room, the kind that speaks of relief, reflection, and the quiet triumph of order restored. Beyond the window, the village awoke in gentle rhythm, unaware of the drama that had played out behind closed doors. Birds chirped softly, and the faint murmur of villagers beginning their day drifted upward from the streets below. Miss Marple allowed herself a final, contemplative sip of tea. The house, once a stage of tension and hidden threats, now exuded a fragile calm. Leonard Howard's misdeeds had been revealed, the frightened had been reassured, and the delicate fabric of St. Mary Mead's society had been preserved. Yet she knew, as she always did, that human hearts were complex, and secrets, even small ones, persisted beneath the surface, waiting for the careful observer to notice. As Jane and Mrs. Weatherby returned to their chores, Miss Marple remained by the window, a serene figure in the morning light. The events of the night had concluded, but her reflections on courage, fear, and human nature would remain, quietly shaping the small village for days to come. And in the soft warmth of the rising sun, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile, satisfied that patience, observation, and gentle guidance had once again restored truth to the hearts of those who sought it. The village of St. Mary Mead had returned to its gentle rhythm, the quiet streets and tidy gardens once again carrying the illusion of simple, uninterrupted peace. The scandal that had unsettled the household of Lady Howard felt, from the outside, like a fleeting disturbance, a momentary flutter in the otherwise placid life of the village. Yet those who had witnessed it knew otherwise. Beneath the neat facades, human hearts held secrets, and courage often revealed itself in small, unexpected ways. Miss Marple, seated in her own drawing room with a steaming cup of tea, allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The events surrounding the maid Jane, the fear she had endured, and Leonard Howard's desperate actions had been, in many ways, a perfect illustration of what Miss Marple had long observed, that the human character, when confronted with fear or desire, cannot help but leave traces that, with patience and careful attention, could be read and understood. She thought of Jane, now safe and comforted by Mrs. Weatherby's steadfast care. The young girl's bravery, her honesty, and her willingness to confront her own fear had been instrumental in uncovering the truth. And Leonard Howard, once a figure of outward charm and quiet influence, had been exposed not by physical pursuit, but by the subtle and inexorable evidence of his own behavior. The village itself would continue to hum along in its ordinary way, with gossip whispered over garden fences and in the pews of St. Mary Mead's church. Some villagers would speculate, some would guess incorrectly, and some would dismiss the events entirely. Yet Miss Marple understood that truth, once revealed, had a persistence all its own, shaping both memory and conscience in ways that no idle chatter could erase. As she set her teacup down, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Justice, in its quietest form, had been served. Fear had been faced, deception unmasked, and the delicate balance of human nature observed and respected. And though the village would continue to harbor secrets, as it always had, the knowledge that careful observation, patience, and courage could uncover the truth remained a reassuring constant. The sun rose higher, spilling golden light across the village, and Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her keen eyes surveying the familiar streets. In her heart, she knew that human nature, in all its complexity, would continue to offer puzzles, but with patience, observation, and quiet reasoning, there were no mysteries that could remain hidden forever. And so St. Mary Mead returned to its tranquil rhythm, the world seemingly ordinary once more, yet quietly wiser for the events of that night. Miss Marple, ever serene, sipped her tea, reflecting on the eternal truth she had long understood. That in every glance, every hesitation, every whispered secret, the story of human hearts is always waiting to be read. The case was closed, the danger past, and the small English village slept once more, its secrets safely laid bare by one woman's gentle yet unerring insight.